If you've ever been betrayed by someone who promised to protect you, stay. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about resurrection. It's about how a woman turned her heartbreak into an empire carved from marble and gold. If stories of strength, justice, and rebirth move you, hit subscribe, because this one will leave you breathless. I still remember the smell of fresh plaster and wet paint the morning I found out I'd been erased. The gallery lights were low, soft as dawn, brushing against the marble pillars I'd spent 2 years designing. Every curve, every line, every gold leaf had my fingerprints buried in it, proof of sleepless nights, sketches scattered across the studio, and quiet wars fought over creative control. But as I stepped closer to the central installation, my heart stopped. The plaque read, "Designed by Alexander Voss." No mention of me. No trace of the woman who'd built this empire with him, brick by brick. My husband's name gleamed under the lights. Mine was gone, as if I'd never existed. At first I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the print shop had missed it. Maybe someone had forgotten to check the final proof. But then I saw him, standing near the champagne table, charming a circle of investors with that rehearsed, effortless grin. He looked immaculate in his tailored suit, hand brushing the lapel where my initials used to be stitched. "Darling," he said when he noticed me, voice low, silky. "You made it." "Made it?" I wanted to laugh. "I built it." He took my hand as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't just wiped me from our legacy. Cameras flashed. I smiled for them, a hollow, trembling smile, because I had learned long ago that women like me aren't allowed to break in public. When the guests finally drifted away, I asked him quietly, "Why isn't my name on the design?" He sipped his champagne. "You were on leave, love. I had to finalize things. Clients get confused with too many voices." "Too many voices?" I repeated. "You mean mine?" He didn't even flinch, just turned toward the crowd again, the mask never slipping. "Let's not ruin the evening. Everyone's watching." That night, I walked through the exhibit alone, each sculpture whispering what I already knew. I was no longer his partner. I was his shadow. But shadows don't stay quiet forever. Later, in the privacy of our penthouse, I went through his laptop while he slept. I wasn't searching for vengeance then, just the truth. What I found changed everything. Emails, contracts, digital renderings I had created, stripped of metadata and re-uploaded under his name, licensing deals pending under his sole ownership, and one folder titled Transition Plan. Inside, drafts of a press release announcing his solo design firm, effective in 3 weeks. My name appeared once, buried deep in the text. Mira Voss has chosen to step away to focus on family. I didn't choose anything. I closed the laptop slowly, the hum of the city echoing beneath our window. Every light that shimmered below reminded me of the years I'd sacrificed. My 20s, my passion, my art, for a man who was already writing me out of my own story. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not yet. Not grief either. It was resolve, cold, sharp, unyielding. He thought he'd erased me, but he'd only cleared the canvas, and I was ready to start carving again, this time in marble and gold. Sendrni. The morning after the gallery opening, sunlight sliced through the penthouse windows like a scalpel. Every reflection in the glass seemed to accuse me of naivety, of silence, of the years I'd given to a man who was now erasing me pixel by pixel. Alexander was already gone when I woke. His side of the bed was smooth, untouched. On the marble countertop, a single note in his careful handwriting read, "Breakfast meeting with the Zurich investors. Don't wait up." No signature. He never signed anything for me anymore. I sat there for a long time, the silence pressing against my ribs, until my phone buzzed, a notification from one of my design assistants, or rather his assistant now, just confirming the changes to the Voss Atelier branding files. Attached was the new logo, the minimalist gold V we'd drawn together over wine years ago, now stripped of the intertwining M that used to curve through it like a signature. I should have cried. Instead, I laughed. It wasn't the brittle laugh of a woman defeated. It was the low, dangerous sound of someone remembering who she really was. That afternoon, I took a cab to my old studio, the one Alexander had temporarily closed while I was on maternity leave. The glass door still bore our shared names, faintly visible where his team had tried to scrape mine off. The space smelled like dust and memory. I ran my fingers along the drafting table where I'd spent 1,000 nights sketching, tracing the grooves from years of work. And then, as if pulled by instinct, I opened the locked drawer on the right, the one he'd forgotten existed. Inside were the originals, the blueprints, signed and dated by me, the proof of authorship that had built the Voss brand. Every major installation, every commissioned gallery piece, every design that bore his name. My signature was there in graphite and ink. I took them all, rolled them neatly, tucked them into a leather portfolio, and slid them into my bag. It was the first move in a war he didn't know he'd already lost. Maukor. In that night, I called Lena, my oldest friend, an art lawyer who'd left the industry after one too many betrayals of her own. She answered on the second ring, voice soft but wary. Mira, it's been forever. I need your help, I said. No hesitation. He's stolen my work. By midnight, she was sitting across from me in my kitchen, her glasses slipping down her nose as she leafed through the blueprints. These are originals, she whispered. You have dates, sketches, drafts, metadata on the digital files. I do, I said, sliding a flash drive across the table. Everything's archived, even the revisions he pretended to make. She leaned back, eyes calculating. Then you can destroy him. Legally, publicly, completely. I smiled. No, I don't want to destroy him. I want to rebuild myself, so completely that he becomes irrelevant. Pitas! And if the plan began that night, I stopped thinking like a betrayed wife and started thinking like an architect again, not of buildings, but of justice. First, I needed resources. Alexander had frozen our joint accounts weeks ago, under the guise of financial restructuring, but he'd underestimated my foresight. Years before, I'd invested a small inheritance from my grandmother in a side project, a marble restoration studio in Florence, that Alexander had dismissed as your little hobby. That hobby had quietly tripled in value. I sold my shares within 48 hours. The funds landed in an offshore account under my name only, enough to start again. Next, I reached out to the people he'd alienated, the artists, architects, and interns who'd been pushed out by his ambition. Some were hesitant at first. Others didn't pick up, but a few did. They remembered me. They remembered who the real artist was behind the brand. We met in secret, in cafes, in co-working spaces, in late-night calls across time zones. We began to design again. Not installations, not facades, but something bigger. Something that would carry my name so loudly that even the walls of his penthouse would tremble when he heard it. I called it Mira Atelier. Modern, independent, revolutionary, architectural. The first project was personal, a museum wing in Rome that had been in planning limbo for years. The foundation wanted innovation. Alexander had given them predictability. I offered them truth, a vision of permanence and vulnerability interwoven, structures that seemed to breathe. They signed with me within a week. And when Alexander found out, he didn't call me. He didn't email. He sent lawyers. They arrived with polished smiles and a cease and desist letter, accusing me of misuse of proprietary intellectual property. I read the letter once, then handed it to Lena. She grinned. Perfect, she said. He just admitted your work was his property, the same work signed by you. We'll file a counterclaim for artistic fraud. That was the moment the tide turned. But what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that I was already building something he couldn't touch. Something more than a company, a movement. I began sharing glimpses of my new work online. Not full reveals, just fragments, sketches of sculptural facades, videos of hands carving marble, captions like, "You can't erase what's carved in stone." The posts went viral. People wanted to know who I was. And when the reveal came, when I stepped into the Rome Gallery to announce the partnership, every major art publication was there. The headline the next morning made me smile. Erased no more. Mira Voss returns, and she's rewriting the future of design. Alexander's PR team released a statement within hours, calling it a misunderstanding. But the cracks were spreading. Investors were pulling out. Sponsors were questioning his authorship. Still, revenge wasn't the fuel that kept me awake at night. It was purpose. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Yet deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. He wasn't the kind of man to surrender gracefully, and I wasn't done showing him that the woman he tried to erase was already carving her name into eternity. And the day the Rome contract went public, my phone exploded. Messages from journalists, gallery owners, even friends who'd disappeared when Alexander and I were still the golden couple. Everyone wanted a quote, a collaboration, a soundbite. but I wasn't speaking. Not yet. Silence was my strategy now, because silence forces people to fill in the blanks with their own curiosity, and curiosity spreads faster than any statement. By the time Alexander's legal team filed their official complaint, the court of public opinion had already chosen a side. Mine. But public sympathy alone doesn't win wars. Evidence does. And I was collecting it carefully, piece by piece, the way a sculptor chips marble, patiently, deliberately, until the truth begins to emerge. And this mum. It started with a name, Evelyn Marks, one of Alexander's former assistants. I found her through a private industry forum under a pseudonym. She'd quit abruptly a year earlier after ethical disagreements with management. That phrase was my beacon. We met in a small cafe near the Thames, where she'd been freelancing since leaving his firm. She was younger than I remembered, barely 30, her posture still shrinking whenever she mentioned him. He made us falsify metadata, she confessed quietly, stirring her coffee even though it had already gone cold. Every project that had your name on it, he made us replace the author tag before submission. He said it was for consistency, but I knew it was wrong. Do you still have access to any of the files? I asked. She hesitated. I backed up some drafts for, protection. Protection. That word made my skin prickle. We all protected ourselves from Alexander in one way or another, from his charm, his temper, his control disguised as kindness. When she handed me the encrypted drive, I didn't realize it yet, but that small silver rectangle would become the weapon that cracked his empire wide open. Alina and I spent nights going through the files. It was painstaking work. Timestamps, version histories, design notes. Each line of data told the same story, that the original creations had been mine, not ours. Mine. But Lena's legal mind saw something I didn't. He didn't just steal your art, she said one night, pushing her glasses up her nose. He laundered it through shell entities. See these contracts? He transferred rights to offshore companies that don't exist anymore. That's fraud. I leaned over the table, scanning the documents. If we expose this, his investors will flee. Exactly, she said, eyes glinting. But we're not just exposing him. We're framing it as a rebirth. Your rebirth. That's when the idea of the documentary was born. And it wasn't a traditional film. It was an immersive installation. Part confession, part evidence room. I called it The Art of Erasure. 12 rooms, each representing a stage of my disappearance. Conception, creation, manipulation, silence, loss, and finally, rebirth. Each space was filled with fragments of my real work, projections of drafts, recorded arguments, blurred images of gallery openings where my smile hid the truth. At the center of the exhibit stood a single sculpture, a cracked marble bust of a woman's face, half polished, half raw stone. The plaque beneath it read, "You can chip away at a woman, but you cannot erase her form." The installation was scheduled to open in Paris, under the Mira Atelier banner. Invitations went to every major publication, every critic who had once praised Alexander. I sent one to him too, hand-delivered, sealed in gold wax. No words, just a card that said, "I hope you still like marble." And for weeks leading up to the event, I could feel his presence circling like a storm just beyond the horizon, through whispers in the industry, through the subtle retractions his PR team issued. He tried to preempt me, to paint me as unstable, claiming I was manipulating public perception for personal gain. It didn't matter. The tide was already turning. The night before the opening, I received an email from a blocked address. The subject line read, "You don't know what you're doing." The message was short. "Stop this now, Mira. You're out of your depth. Some things are better left buried." I stared at it for a long time, my pulse steady, my fear replaced by something cleaner, anticipation. Because I did know what I was doing. I had spent years studying Alexander, mapping every arrogance, every weakness. And now, I was sculpting his downfall with the same precision I once used to shape marble. Then when the exhibition opened, Paris glowed like a fever dream. The gallery was packed. The air buzzed with tension and whispers. Cameras clicked, lights flared, and for the first time in years, my name was everywhere. As guests entered, they passed under a sign that read, "Dedicated to every woman whose name was erased," and who carved it back. Each room led them deeper into my story. My voice played through hidden speakers, calm, deliberate, almost intimate, as I narrated fragments of memory, By the 6th room, viewers realized they weren't just witnessing an artist's journey. They were walking through a confession, one that pointed directly to Alexander's fraud. And then, at the climax, in the 11th room, a video played on a loop. A time-stamped screen recording of the stolen files Evelyn had given me, metadata and all. It showed the original author tags being deleted, replaced with AVOS. The audience fell silent. Some gasped, some took photos. By the time Alexander arrived, furious, flanked by his attorneys, the footage was already viral. The hashtag #ErasedNoMore trended within hours. I watched from the mezzanine as he stormed through the gallery, his face pale under the spotlights. He looked up once, our eyes meeting across the crowd. His mouth formed my name, not with affection, but with disbelief. He hadn't realized until that moment that I'd built the entire exhibition as a trap, a public one. He'd walked straight into the frame I'd designed for him, the perfect portrait of a man caught rewriting history. And that night, after the chaos subsided and the gallery emptied, I stood alone in the 12th room. Rebirth, white walls, a single sculpture rising from the floor, unfinished yet radiant. My tools lay beside it, untouched since morning. I pressed my hand against the cool marble and whispered, "You can't erase what's already carved in truth." Somewhere outside, I heard the flash of cameras, the murmur of news anchors, the hum of a city realizing the lie it had lived with for too long. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something softer, a quiet power, like the stillness before dawn, because this wasn't the end. The exhibition was just the beginning of his unraveling, and of my resurrection. He had tried to erase my name from stone. Now, the whole world would remember it. The morning after the Paris exhibition, the world smelled like smoke. Not real smoke, but that sharp electric scent that lingers after something burns. And Alexander's empire was smoldering. By sunrise, 3 of his major investors had withdrawn. 2 corporate sponsors had frozen their contracts pending investigation. The art world's golden boy, once untouchable, was suddenly radioactive. I watched it unfold from my apartment balcony, coffee in hand, the headlines cascading across my phone screen like fireworks. Voss accused of fraud. Ex-wife exposes massive art scandal, stolen designs. Mira Voss speaks through art, the queen of marble returns. And her revenge is beautiful, Lena called before I'd even finished reading the first article. Her voice was a mix of exhaustion and restrained triumph. "They've opened a federal inquiry," she said. "Forgery, misattribution, laundering through shell entities. You hit him harder than any courtroom could." I exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping me. "It's not over yet." "No," she agreed, "but for the first time, he's the one running." Alexander's first move was predictable. He went silent. No statements, no interviews. His PR team issued a vague denial. Misunderstandings, creative miscommunications, a complex collaboration misrepresented by the media. But the silence from him personally was louder than any defense. Behind that silence, though, he was moving. I knew it. He'd always been a strategist, a man who never accepted defeat, only delay. So I prepared for the counterattack. While the public devoured the scandal, I worked quietly behind the scenes, consolidating everything I'd built. Mira Atelier was expanding faster than I'd imagined. Commissions, partnerships, requests flooding in. The Rome project had doubled its budget. The Paris installation was being requested for a global tour. For the first time, I wasn't building under his shadow. I was shaping my own skyline. Still, the thrill of victory felt haunted, because every triumph carried the echo of the years he'd stolen. The laughter I'd swallowed, the silence I'd lived inside. One evening, while reviewing plans for the new museum commission, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass, strong, poised, unflinching. But behind it, a flicker of the woman I used to be still lingered, wide-eyed, hopeful, too eager to be loved. And I realized something that twisted my stomach. Revenge had rebuilt me, yes, but it had also remade me into something harder, colder. 3 days later, I got a message from an unknown number. "You win. Let's talk." I stared at the screen, heartbeat steady. I didn't respond. By sunset, there was another message, face to face. "You owe me that much." Owe him? The audacity almost made me laugh, but part of me wanted to see him, not out of nostalgia, but to measure the distance between who I was and who I'd become. So I agreed. One meeting, neutral ground. A café near Montmartre, where the walls were lined with unfinished sketches, fitting, I thought, for two people whose story had been anything but complete. He arrived 20 minutes late, as always. Some habits never die. He looked thinner, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The arrogance that once carried him now cracked at the edges. "Mira," he said softly, like my name was a memory, "you've made your point." I sipped my coffee, saying nothing. "I built everything for us," he continued, leaning forward. "You think you were the only one who sacrificed? I made you famous." I smiled. Slow, surgical. "You made me invisible." His jaw tightened. "You turned this into a spectacle. You've destroyed my reputation, our company." "Our company?" I interrupted. "You mean the one you rebranded under your name while I was in recovery from childbirth? The one you scrubbed my signature from?" He looked away. Silence stretched between us like glass about to shatter. Finally, he said, "You don't understand what this kind of exposure does. The investors, the press, I'll be ruined." I set down my cup gently. "You erased me without hesitation. Why should I care about your reputation?" His eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar there. Not arrogance, not anger, but fear. Genuine, bone-deep fear. "You think this will fix you?" he asked quietly. "Revenge doesn't rebuild. It corrodes." I leaned in. "No, Alexander. It reveals. It scrapes away the lies until only truth remains." He flinched like I'd struck him. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't my enemy anymore. He was just a man terrified of the mirror I'd forced him to look into. After he left, I stayed in the cafe for a long time, tracing the rim of my cup. My hands no longer trembled. My heart didn't race. It was as if the battle had already ended, and all that was left was the quiet aftermath, the sound of marble dust settling after the final strike of the chisel. But wars like ours never end neatly. The next morning, the Parisian papers reported that Alexander's accounts had been frozen pending investigation. Whistleblowers from inside his firm were stepping forward. Evelyn's testimony had been published in Le Monde. The Art Foundation had formally rescinded his membership. The empire he'd built, my empire he'd stolen, was collapsing brick by brick. And yet, I didn't feel the triumph I'd imagined. Instead, there was an ache, not sympathy, but the hollow awareness that destroying him hadn't filled the void he'd left. That night, I walked through the empty atelier, the soft hum of the city below me. On one of the work tables lay an unfinished model, the foundation for my next project. I reached for a chisel and pressed it to the marble, carving the first stroke with deliberate precision. It wasn't anger guiding my hand now. It was freedom. As white dust gathered under my fingers, I whispered to the stone, "He thought he could erase me, but even ruins can become monuments." And outside, beneath the hum of the Paris skyline, I felt the faint tremor of something new beginning. Not vengeance, not justice, but creation. Mani diwani nani star niam, but peace never comes easily to those who've waged wars. A week later, an envelope arrived at my studio. No return address, just my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, the two of us years ago standing in front of the very first model we built together. On the back, a line written in ink that bled through the paper. "Every empire falls, but not all of them stay buried." I stared at it for a long time before sliding it into the drawer beside my blueprints, because I knew what he meant. He wasn't done, and neither was I. And the envelope haunted me for days. It sat on the corner of my drafting table like a relic, the photo inside whispering with the weight of years I'd rather forget. I told myself it was just another attempt to regain control, a desperate gesture from a man watching his empire crumble. But a part of me, the part that still remembered the sound of his laugh when things were good, couldn't ignore it. When you share a dream with someone for a decade, the memories don't vanish when the dream does. They calcify. They wait for your weakest hour to resurface. And I was tired. Not defeated, not broken, but tired in a way that sleep couldn't touch. It had been 6 months since the Paris exhibition detonated our lives. Mira Atelier had become a global name. I was on magazine covers, my face framed by marble and gold, my story hailed as the reclamation of the century. Yet behind the accolades, my days blurred into endless strategy meetings, interviews, brand negotiations. I was succeeding beyond anything I'd imagined, but success can be another kind of prison when it's built from vengeance. So when Alexander's name appeared in my inbox again, I didn't delete it this time. Subject: proposal for discussion. You've proven your point, Mira. You've won. But maybe there's a way for us both to survive this. Meet me at the Atelier du Nord, Friday, 8 p.m. There were no threats this time. No arrogance. Just a strange, calculated humility that unsettled me more than his fury ever had. That Friday arrived draped in the kind of gray Parisian rain that feels theatrical. The sky heavy, the streets slick and reflective like wet glass. I wore black, simple and deliberate. I wanted armor, not decoration. The Atelier du Nord was half empty when I arrived. A minimalist restaurant tucked inside an old warehouse near the canal, its walls lined with exposed steel beams. He was already there, waiting at a corner table, the picture of studied calm. He looked different, thinner still, though his suit fit impeccably. His hair, once meticulously styled, had grown out, softening his profile. But his eyes, those hadn't changed. The same gray-blue, the same calculation beneath the gentleness. "Mira," he said, standing as I approached. "You look—" "Don't," I interrupted. "We're not here for pleasantries." He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. The waiter approached, and without asking, Alexander ordered 2 glasses of Merlot, a reflex from another lifetime. When the glasses arrived, he leaned forward, voice low. "You've made your mark. Everyone knows your name. I've lost everything, except one thing you can't take from me, the legacy we built together." I tilted my head. "You mean the one you tried to claim as yours?" He flinched. "I made mistakes," he said, voice softening. "I was afraid that the world would only see me through you, that I'd disappear. The irony almost made me laugh. And so you erased me first." "Yes." His admission came like a crack in stone. "But you have to see, I didn't do it because I hated you. I did it because I couldn't compete with you." For a long moment, I said nothing. The rain outside thudded against the glass in rhythmic pulses. His words hung between us like smoke. Finally, I asked, "Why am I here?" He exhaled, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were schematics, architectural renderings, detailed and familiar. I recognized the project instantly. The Dubai Cultural Pavilion, one of the most prestigious commissions in the world. "I was approached before the scandal," he explained. "They want innovation, boldness. They were ours, Mira, our style, our design language. I can't do it without you." I closed the folder, the weight of it heavy in my hands. "You want me to collaborate with you again?" "I want us to finish what we started," he said. "Not as husband and wife, as artists. We could sign under both names, publicly, equal credit. You get the recognition, I get a chance at redemption." The audacity of it almost made me smile. He was offering equality now, something I had begged for years ago, when equality still meant something. "Why should I help you resurrect yourself?" I asked. "Because," he said quietly, "I can still make you greater." That was the moment I saw it, the flicker of the old Alexander, the man who believed that power was something to give or withhold. He still thought he could shape me, but I wasn't clay anymore. I stood slowly, the glass of wine untouched. "I don't need you to make me greater. I already am." He watched me, silent. Then, almost pleading, "Don't turn this into annihilation, Mira. If we go to court, we'll destroy each other." I leaned in, close enough for him to hear the calm certainty in my voice. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided I was expendable." And then I left. And for days after, I couldn't shake the meeting from my mind. His offer wasn't just desperate, it was strategic. If I collaborated with him, even once, he could frame the entire scandal as a creative dispute resolved, muddying the legal waters. It would blur the truth I had carved in stone. But there was something deeper too, something unspoken. Part of me still wanted closure that no lawsuit or headline could deliver. I wanted to stand in front of him one last time and see him understand. Not fear, not rage, but understanding. Lena called that week, her voice sharp as ever. "He's baiting you. Don't give him the satisfaction." "I'm not," I said, "but maybe I can use his offer." "How?" "By taking what he wanted and doing it better." The idea struck like lightning, sudden, alive, impossible to ignore. If Alexander wanted the Dubai Commission as his comeback, I'd make it my masterpiece. I contacted the pavilion board through private channels, presented a counter-proposal, a design not born from rivalry, but resurrection. A living structure sculpted from marble and glass, built to shift with sunlight, symbolizing transparency and endurance. They hesitated at first. 2 competing bids, one drenched in scandal, one daringly new. But when I unveiled the prototype, there was silence in the boardroom, and then applause. Within a week, the contract was mine. The announcement hit the press like thunder. The headlines didn't need to mention his name, but they did anyway. Mira Voss selected for Dubai Pavilion. A new era begins. Alexander didn't call. He didn't email. But I knew he'd read it. Somewhere, he'd seen the headline and understood exactly what I had done. Taken his last chance at resurrection and turned it into my coronation. And that night, I returned to the atelier alone. The city glowed beneath me, lights reflecting off the Seine, the hum of traffic like a pulse. I stood before the scale model of the pavilion, its surface glimmering with gold filament. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. Not pride either. Something quieter. Something like peace. Because revenge had never been about destroying him. It was about remembering myself. Still, as I looked at the marble curves catching the faintest trace of moonlight, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the story between us wasn't finished. There was one more reckoning left, not in courtrooms or headlines, but somewhere deeper. And when it came, I intended to face it not as the woman he erased, but as the one who rebuilt herself from the dust. In the Dubai Pavilion should have felt like triumph. It was the kind of commission architects dream about. Monumental, visionary, the kind of work that rewrites your name into history. Yet as the first slabs of Carrara marble were lifted into place under the desert sun, I felt a disquiet humming in my bones. Success, I had learned, doesn't silence your past. It only amplifies the echoes. The press called it the era of Mira Voss. My studio had doubled in size. The Rome and Paris installations were still touring, and my face appeared on magazine covers that once belonged to men like Alexander. Clients wanted to meet me. Universities wanted to host me. Every article framed me as the woman who couldn't be erased. And yet, behind that gleaming narrative, whispers began to creep in. First, a journalist emailed Lena asking for comment on irregularities in my licensing files, documents that, according to an anonymous source, contained conflicting signatures. Then came the rumors, unverified claims that some of the blueprints from the art of erasure had been forged to frame Alexander. The whispers grew into murmurs. Murmurs became headlines. Was Mira's revenge built on a lie? Anonymous leaks question. Authenticity of Voss evidence. I recognized his hand immediately. Alexander was playing his last card. Deception, dressed as doubt. Lena slammed her laptop shut when she saw the third headline. He's manufacturing controversy. Probably bribed a journalist to question the evidence. I rubbed my temples. Let him. Anyone who's seen the work knows the truth. She shook her head. You can't rely on truth alone. He's weaponizing perception, the same way you did. You built your comeback through art and story. He's trying to corrode that story from the inside. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Because she was right. Alexander didn't need to prove I'd lied. He just needed to make people wonder. Doubt, once seated, grows roots faster than truth. That night, I returned to my studio long after the team had gone home. The city outside was alive, 1,000 lights flickering across glass towers, the hum of traffic below like a distant heartbeat. I scrolled through the articles, the comment sections, the endless thread of speculation. Somewhere in the noise, I saw my reflection in the dark window, fragmented, half illuminated. The woman in the glass looked powerful, yes, but also haunted. I wondered how much of my identity now existed only through the stories people told about me. When did I stop being Mira, the artist, and become Mira, the myth? By the end of the week, the rumors had begun to affect contracts. 2 minor sponsors withdrew from the Rome exhibition, citing brand sensitivity. An interviewer canceled at the last minute. Even the Dubai board requested an additional ethics review before finalizing my next phase. Alexander's game was working. Quietly, invisibly, he was painting me with the same brush he'd used on himself. Unreliable, manipulative, morally gray. So I decided to confront him directly. He was easy to find. His old office in Zurich had been shuttered, but through industry channels I learned he was consulting for a private investment firm, a sanitized title for a man rebuilding under the radar. I didn't call. I didn't warn. I just arrived. The receptionist recognized me instantly. Ms. Voss, he's in a meeting, but he'll want to see me, I said, stepping past her. When I entered the boardroom, he was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a projection. He froze when he saw me, a flicker of recognition, then that familiar smirk of control sliding back into place. Mira, he said, dismissing the others. I was wondering when you'd show up. I closed the door behind me. You think leaking forged files will save you? He shrugged. I didn't leak anything. The truth has a way of surfacing on its own. I crossed the room until I stood inches from him. You don't get to rewrite this again. He tilted his head, studying me. Funny, that's exactly what I was going to say to you. You turned our story into a morality play. The innocent artist versus the corrupt husband. But maybe people deserve to know it wasn't that simple. It was that simple? You erased me, and you erased everything else, he said softly, including the fact that I loved you. The words landed like a slap. Because once, before ambition devoured us, that had been true. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You built your redemption on my destruction. You made me the villain so you could be the phoenix. Do you really think the world won't eventually tire of your perfection? His breath was calm, calculated. He was trying to destabilize me, the way he used to in negotiations. Push, test, twist. But the woman standing before him wasn't the one who once sought his validation. You don't get to weaponize love after using it as camouflage, I said quietly. He smiled. A cold, wounded thing. We'll see what the world believes. 2 days later, the first anonymous op-ed appeared. It was written by a former associate who claimed to have witnessed ethical manipulation within Mira Atelier. The accusations were vague but devastating, that I'd exaggerated my role in the partnership, that I'd rewritten history to suit my own narrative. Every article quoted the same line. She learned from the best, and became worse. I didn't need to wonder who wrote it. For the first time since Paris, I felt fear. Not for my reputation, I could survive that, but for the truth itself. Because truth, once fractured, never quite fits back together the same way. Mayinashi, Lena wanted to sue. Defamation. We'll bury him legally this time. But I hesitated. Legal battles would drag the story out for years, and the headlines would feed on it. What I needed wasn't another war. It was a mirror. Something that showed the world, unmistakably, what I stood for. So I did what I always did when cornered. I created. Anananine. I began designing a new piece. One that wasn't about him or me, but about the nature of truth itself. I called it The Mirror and the Fire. It would debut in Dubai, in the atrium of the pavilion, timed with its grand opening. The concept was simple, but the execution brutal. A massive sculpture of 2 figures, one carved from white marble, pristine and cold, the other cast in bronze, molten, its features half-formed. The 2 stood facing each other across a shallow pool of water, their reflections merging in ripples of light. An inscription along the base read, "The lie burns, the truth endures, but both leave scars." The piece took months. I sculpted most of it myself, refusing help. The process was physical, punishing, but it stripped the noise away. Every strike of the chisel became a declaration. I would not defend myself with words. I would do it with permanence. When the pavilion finally opened, the crowd was enormous. Critics, dignitaries, investors. Cameras flashed as I stepped onto the stage to speak. Art, I said, my voice steady, isn't about proving who's right. It's about revealing what's real, even when reality hurts. Behind me, the sculpture gleamed in the desert light. Marble and bronze, truth and deception, forever intertwined. For a long moment, the audience was silent. Then, applause, thunderous, rising, unstoppable. In that sound, I felt something fracture and settle all at once, because Alexander could forge headlines, manipulate narratives, ignite rumors, but he could never create something that lived. But that night, I returned to my hotel balcony, the city sprawling endless below. My phone buzzed. One new message. You won the crowd again. But mirrors don't forget who stands before them. I stared at the screen, then turned it off, let him haunt his own reflection, because I was done fighting ghosts. But the next morning, when I stepped into the pavilion, one of the marble panels at the base of the sculpture had been cracked clean through, as if struck deliberately. No alarms, no witnesses, only silence. And in that silence, I understood. He wasn't finished, and neither was the fire. Madine. The sound of marble splitting is almost sacred. If you've ever worked with it, you know. There's a tone, a pitch, a vibration that runs through the air when stone breaks. It isn't just noise, it's a wound. That morning, as I stood in the atrium of the Dubai pavilion, staring at the hairline fracture running through the base of the mirror and the fire, I felt that sound humming inside my chest. The crack wasn't large. It ran diagonally across the marble figure's lower torso, thin as a vein, but unmistakable. To the untrained eye, it could have been an accident. Stress from heat, expansion, a flaw in the stone. But I knew better. Marble doesn't crack overnight. Someone had done this. The security footage revealed nothing. The pavilion's cameras had glitched between 2:13 and 2:22 a.m. 9 minutes erased from the feed, conveniently the same window during which the temperature sensors detected a sudden drop in the atrium. Someone had accessed the system remotely. An inside job. The building's night guard swore he'd seen no one. No broken locks. No alarms. Yet the next morning, when the maintenance team arrived, they found traces of metallic residue near the sculpture's base. A tool mark, faint, but deliberate. Lena flew in that night. Her presence brought the kind of silence that always came before she dropped a truth I didn't want to hear. "It's sabotage," she said flatly, crouching beside the damage, "and it's meant to look like an omen. Psychological warfare." I folded my arms. "He wouldn't risk something so obvious." "Wouldn't he?" she countered. "He's already lost his reputation." "What's one more scandal if it means taking you down with him?" She was right. And yet something about it felt too theatrical, too perfectly symbolic. A crack through marble, in the very piece that represented truth-enduring lies. It was his signature all over again, subtle cruelty disguised as coincidence. I had the panel reinforced immediately. The engineers wanted to replace it entirely, but I refused. "No," I said. "Leave it visible. Seal it with gold." They looked at me like I was mad, but there was method in my defiance. I instructed them to fill the fracture with kintsugi resin, the Japanese art of mending broken pottery with gold. It was an act of reclamation, to take damage and turn it into design. When the restoration was finished, the sculpture looked even more powerful. The golden vein glimmered in the desert light, like lightning captured in stone. The crack became the centerpiece, no longer a flaw, but a declaration. The press arrived within hours. I was ready for them. "Yes," I told the reporters calmly, "the piece was damaged, but art, like truth, survives fracture. What breaks can be remade, stronger, more beautiful, impossible to erase." The photos went viral again. The headlines spun it as poetic resilience. And for a fleeting moment, I believed I had turned his attack into another triumph. But victories like that are short-lived. A week later, I received a call from my Dubai site manager. "Madam, we've had an incident." He sounded breathless. "The press is reporting it already. Someone leaked an internal memo claiming you fabricated your own sabotage, that it was a publicity stunt." I froze. "Who leaked it?" "We're investigating," he said, his voice trembling. "But the journalist mentioned having direct communication with a former collaborator. Alexander. Again. It was elegant, really. His genius weaponized against me. If he couldn't destroy my art, he'd taint its meaning, turn admiration into suspicion. Within hours, the story spread. Did Mira Voss stage the damage to gain sympathy? I could almost hear him whispering behind every headline. Lena handled the crisis with her usual composure. "We issue a statement denying involvement," she said, scrolling through drafts. "Then we provide the engineering report proving the sabotage was real." I shook my head. "No, that's what he wants. For me to react, to defend. Every time I explain myself, I feed his narrative." "So what's the plan?" I looked out the window at the glowing skyline. "Let him burn his voice out. Then I'll answer once, with something he can't twist." Chaffee. That night, I revisited every file Evelyn had given us. The stolen metadata, the contracts, the evidence that had ended his career. Buried in one of the encrypted folders, I found a forgotten document labeled Voss Private, Archive 04 Redline. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a draft of a partnership agreement between Alexander's old firm and a Saudi development group. The terms were outrageous. Hidden asset transfers, false authorship clauses, and his digital signature on every page. The file was dated after his supposed exit from the company. Fraud. Federal level. He hadn't just sabotaged me. He'd been laundering money through his defunct network, trying to fund his comeback under aliases. And now, because of his vendetta, I had proof. The next morning, I made the quietest, most dangerous decision of my life. I didn't send the file to Lena. I didn't leak it to the press. I sent it directly to him. Subject line, You forgot something. No message, no threats, just the file. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Mira. His voice rasped. Where did you get that? You left it behind when you were too busy trying to erase me, I said. He inhaled sharply. If that gets out, it won't. I cut him off. As long as you disappear. Completely. No more leaks, no more games. You vanish, and I bury it. That's the deal. Silence. Then low. You think you've won. No, I said softly. I stopped playing, and then I hung up. But for days there was nothing. No headlines, no messages. The storm simply died. The pavilion reopened without incident. Investors returned. The golden vein became a symbol of endurance worldwide. Photos of it flooded social media, hashtags like Narn Crack of Courage trending across continents. But beneath the calm, I could still feel it. That low, electric hum of unfinished business. You can't silence someone like Alexander forever. You can only bury him long enough for him to suffocate on his own silence. One evening, as I stood before the sculpture again, a child approached the display, pointing at the gold-filled crack. Why is it broken? She asked. I knelt beside her. Because sometimes, I said, things have to break to show how strong they really are. She smiled. It's prettier that way. I smiled back and realized she was right. The crack had changed everything. It had changed me. Later that night, a courier delivered a small black box to my hotel. Inside was a single piece of marble, chipped and veined with gold, the same material used to seal the fracture. Attached was a note, written in Alexander's elegant script. You win, for now, but even marble remembers the sculptor's hands. I stared at it, the gold shimmering faintly under the lamplight, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear or anger. I felt pity, because he still believed he was the sculptor. But I had become the stone, and stones, once carved by fire, don't yield again. For weeks after the message and the marble shard, silence became my shadow. The world had moved on, the noise dimmed, and my name once again shimmered under headlines that spoke of vision, artistry, and resilience. Yet beneath the quiet pulse of success, a tension coiled, invisible but constant, like the tremor of an aftershock waiting to strike again. I thought Alexander had finally retreated into obscurity. The file I sent him was a loaded gun pointed at his own head. I believed that fear, not remorse, would keep him still. But men like him don't disappear. They regenerate. They turn silence into strategy. And sure enough, one evening, that silence cracked. It started with a phone call from Lena. Her tone wasn't panicked, not exactly, but there was a kind of cold precision in her voice that made my stomach tighten. Mira, she said, you're going to want to sit down. I'm at the atelier, I replied, pacing between sketches and scale models. What's going on? The Swiss Financial Authority opened a cross-border audit this morning, she said. Your name came up. They're reviewing transfers linked to Voss Atelier AG, Alexander's old company. Someone filed a report claiming you received funds from one of their accounts. My hand went still on the drafting table. That's impossible. I cut every financial tie years ago. I know, Lena said, but the account they're talking about, it's not closed. Apparently, there were payments routed through a shell company in Florence. Small amounts, spread over months. It looks like income, like royalties. My breath caught. Florence, my marble restoration studio. The inheritance I'd used to rebuild my life. He'd found a way to reach backward into my past. And that night, I barely slept. The documents Lena forwarded sat open on my screen. Transaction IDs, routing numbers, digital signatures. And at the center of it all, one name leapt out like a wound reopened. M. Voss, secondary partner authorization. Forgery. Again. Only this time, the forgery wasn't meant to steal credit. It was meant to implicate me. I zoomed in on the digital signature. At first glance, it looked perfect. The same slant, the same elegant curl at the end. But there was a tremor in the line, a faint distortion only visible when magnified. He had copied my hand so faithfully that even the system's encryption accepted it as real. He wanted to bury me under the same kind of accusation that had buried him. And this time, it was legal, not emotional, not symbolic. A noose made of paper and ink. I called Lena again. If he's behind this, he's escalating. He wants me discredited, maybe even indicted. She was silent for a moment. We can fight it. We'll subpoena the digital logs. But Mira, what? The auditors will find the transfer trail. Even if we prove the signature was forged, the money still exists. If he planted it right, it'll look like you were complicit. I closed my eyes. So he's not just trying to ruin my reputation. He's trying to destroy my freedom. So by morning, news outlets were circling the story like vultures. The whispers started again. The same tone of suspicion. The same recycled headlines. Swiss authorities probe architect in fraud case, linked to former husband. Mira Voss under investigation. Shadow of scandal returns. I didn't cry. I didn't even panic. I just felt the old armor settle back over my skin. He had dragged me into another battlefield, and this one would leave no marble to hide behind. 3 days later, I received an encrypted email from an anonymous sender. No subject line, no signature, just a link. Lena advised against opening it. It could be a trap, malware, ransomware, anything. But something about it, the timing, the silence, told me it was from him, and I needed to see what game he was playing. I opened it, the screen filled with a scanned contract. A joint investment agreement dated 8 months ago. My signature again. A digital timestamp placing me in Zurich the day it was filed. Attached were scanned receipts, correspondence, even flight logs. Only one problem. I had never been in Zurich that month. I was in Rome, overseeing construction on the museum expansion. He'd forged not only documents, he'd forged time. The final page bore a clause that made my pulse spike. In the event of either partner's death, all shared intellectual property shall revert to the surviving signatory. I stared at it, realization crystallizing like frost. He wasn't just trying to implicate me in fraud. He was setting the stage for something worse. If I were found guilty, my assets, my brand, everything under Mira Atelier could legally revert to the only other named party. To him. Lena's voice trembled when she read it. This isn't sabotage anymore. It's premeditated erasure. Again. I stood by the window, watching the city dissolve in evening haze. He's turning the same weapon against me that I used against him. Story, narrative, evidence. And he's using the law this time, Lena said grimly. We can't fight lies with silence anymore. But silence had always been my sharpest blade. I wasn't going to scream innocence to an audience hungry for scandal. I would expose him quietly, surgically, the way he'd tried to carve me out of existence. Thus I flew to Zurich under the radar. No public announcement, no entourage. The old office building that once housed Voss Atelier AG had been gutted, its glass facade reflecting the river below like a wound sutured with light. Inside, I found what I was looking for, the accountant. He was an older man named Heinrich, a creature of habit who had worked under Alexander for years. When I introduced myself, his eyes flickered with recognition and guilt. I thought you might come, he said quietly, leading me into a back room filled with file boxes. He left something here, something I wasn't supposed to keep. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a small drive labeled Ghost Contract, Draft 0. I plugged it into my laptop, and there it was. The same document Alexander had sent to the auditors, but with one difference. In the metadata history, the author tag read, AVOS, time-stamped 2 days before the final forgery. The original file. Proof that he'd created the fake contract himself. Heinrich looked at me with weary resignation. He told me to delete it. I couldn't. I've seen what he does to people who trust him. I closed the laptop. You've just saved my life. By the time I returned to Dubai, Lena had already filed a protective claim with the authorities. Within a week, the Swiss auditors withdrew my name from the investigation. The evidence trail turned back on Alexander like a snake biting its own tail. But the damage, the story, the doubt, lingered. At a press conference, I said only one sentence. You can forge a signature, but you can't forge a soul. The cameras flashed. The room fell silent. For once, I didn't feel like I was performing. In that night, I received another message, this one unencrypted. You win again. But ghosts don't vanish, Mira. They haunt. No signature. But I knew. And yet, as I read it, I didn't feel fear. Only an odd, quiet sorrow. Because he was right about one thing. Ghosts don't vanish. They linger in the cracks of marble, in the echoes of applause, in the spaces between who we were and who we've become. But maybe, I thought, as I looked out over the glowing desert city, ghosts can also fade. Not when they're buried, but when they're finally seen. And I was done hiding from mine. The leak didn't come from me. That's the part people never believed later. Not the journalists, Not the board. Not even Lena at first. But I swear it. I didn't release the file that ended him. The ghost contract went public one quiet morning in late February. I woke to my phone vibrating endlessly on the bedside table, a flood of notifications lighting up the dark. The first message was from Lena. "Mira, it's everywhere. Every outlet. Every country. He's finished." I opened the news feed, and the world erupted in black text. Voss fraud scandal deepens. Leaked files reveal global money laundering network. Ghost contract connects fallen architect to international scheme. There it was, the same forged contract that had almost destroyed me, now exposed with the original metadata intact. The file trail led directly to Alexander's encrypted accounts, to shell corporations registered under aliases that folded back to his passport number. He was caught, cleanly, undeniably, elegantly. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt the adrenaline of victory. Instead, I felt nothing. The silence in my apartment was thick. Outside, the city was just beginning to stir. The faint hum of cars, the slow bloom of dawn over the desert horizon. I could almost hear the stone of the Dubai pavilion breathing beneath the early light. And by noon, the story was global. Every network played the footage of him leaving his Zurich apartment, camera flashes igniting the night like lightning. His face, pale, hollow, unshaven, filled every screen. The man who had once been untouchable now looked smaller than memory. A relic of arrogance turned to dust. His empire unraveled in days. Investors pulled out. Clients filed lawsuits. Galleries removed his installations overnight, citing ethical concerns. He vanished from public view after that. No one knew where he went. Some said Greece. Others claimed South Africa. But I knew him too well to believe in exile. He wasn't hiding. He was recalculating. Lena came to see me that evening, exhaustion shadowing her sharpness. She poured herself a drink before saying anything. "You didn't leak it," she said. "But someone did. Maybe Heinrich. Maybe someone inside the investigation. Whoever it was, they handed you the cleanest ending you could have asked for." "Ending?" I repeated softly. She met my gaze. "You won." I looked down at my hands, tracing the faint streaks of marble dust embedded in my skin. "Then why does it feel like I lost something too?" And the following weeks were a blur of media frenzy and moral whiplash. My name resurfaced again, not as an accused, but as a prophet of truth, the woman who exposed the architect of deception. Sponsors returned. The Dubai pavilion attendance doubled. But every victory carried the taste of ash. I avoided interviews, refused comment, declined awards. People thought it was humility. It wasn't. It was fatigue, the kind that comes when the war you've been fighting ends, and you realize you don't know who you are without it. Still, I couldn't avoid the final reckoning. Because one evening, as I returned to my hotel after a conference in Doha, the concierge handed me an envelope. No return address. Only my name and handwriting I recognized instantly. Inside, a letter, written in black ink. "You wanted justice. You got it. I wanted legacy. I lost it. They'll destroy me now. But maybe that's fair. You said once that art reveals what's real. So here's my final truth. You were the only real thing I ever made. A." I read it 3 times. The words were calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes at the end of something irreversible. My first instinct was disbelief. A trap. Another manipulation. But then, a second letter arrived 2 days later. This one from the Zurich authorities. "We regret to inform you that Alexander Voss was found deceased in his apartment on March 3rd. Apparent suicide. Case closed. Pending confirmation." I sat down, the paper trembling between my hands. I didn't cry. Not at first. But later, when the lights were off and the hum of the city faded, the tears came. Not for him. Not exactly. But for the years we'd burned building and destroying each other. He had finally erased himself. The world reacted predictably. Memorials, think pieces, documentaries, all dissecting the rise and fall of Alexander Voss. Every narrative painted him differently. Genius, fraud, tragic visionary. My name appeared in every one, tethered to his like gravity. Even in death, he found a way to anchor me. When the journalists came for comments, I gave them a single statement. I hope he finally found silence. They called it poetic, but it wasn't poetry. It was exhaustion in a sentence. Months passed. The investigations closed. His assets were seized. His properties went to auction. Zurich, Berlin, Venice. I didn't attend, but Lena did. She came back with a small parcel. "It was in one of the boxes," she said, setting it on my desk. "The officials said it belonged to you." Inside was a marble fragment, rough-edged, veined with faint gold, the missing piece from the mirror and the fire. I turned it over in my hands. On the underside, faintly carved, were 3 words: "Let me vanish." I didn't know if he'd done it himself or if it was coincidence, but it felt like closure carved in stone. That night, I returned to the pavilion for the first time since the news. The desert air was still and heavy, the marble reflecting the moonlight like bone. I stood before the sculpture, the 2 figures, the mirror and the fire, and for the first time, I saw not confrontation, but symmetry. I placed the fragment at the base, whispering, "You're free now." The wind picked up, scattering sand across the tiles. For a fleeting second, it almost felt like breath. In the months that followed, I withdrew from public life. Mira Atelier continued, but I no longer needed the headlines. I taught, I sculpted, I rebuilt quietly. The world had moved on, but I had no interest in chasing it anymore. Some nights, though, when I walked past the gilded crack of the marble figure, I caught my reflection bending with the gold seam, fractured, luminous, whole in its brokenness, and I realized something profound. Revenge hadn't rebuilt me. Grief had. Truth had. Creation had. Alexander had wanted to leave behind monuments of himself. I left behind meaning, and meaning doesn't crumble when its maker is gone. Some months later, an art critic wrote about the mirror and the fire in Le Monde. His final line stayed with me. In every fracture, Voss carved forgiveness. In every scar, she made peace visible. I folded the clipping and kept it in my sketchbook, because maybe that's what all of this had been about. Not victory, not vengeance, but learning that some legacies aren't built in stone at all. They're built in what survives it. Sastoma. The message from the executor arrived in the middle of an ordinary morning. I was sitting by the window, sketching the silhouette of a new facade. Nothing monumental, just a private commission for a small cultural center in Lisbon, when my phone buzzed. The number was Swiss. I hesitated before answering. Switzerland still carried the taste of ghosts. "Madame Voss?" The voice was formal, precise. "I represent the estate of the late Mr. Alexander Voss. There are items here registered under your name. They are unusual. You are listed as the sole beneficiary of a sealed archive." For a second the pencil slipped from my hand, a faint streak of graphite cutting across the paper like a wound. "An archive?" I managed. "What kind?" "That is for you to decide," he said, but the instructions were explicit. "Deliver in person." 3 weeks later, I found myself back in Zurich. The city was the same, clean, indifferent, its air sharp with snow and order. But walking those streets again, I felt the weight of the years collapse into my chest. Those years of creation and collapse, of marble dust and headlines. The office was small, tucked between a gallery and a watch boutique. The executor, a thin man named Adler, handed me a long, narrow wooden crate. Its surface was unmarked except for one phrase burned into the grain: "To the architect who survived me." Inside lay a single roll of vellum, yellowed with age, bound by a silk ribbon. When I unrolled it, the room seemed to tilt. It was a design, his design, a structure vast and ethereal, a cathedral made not of religion but of light, columns like ribs, a ceiling curved like a wave frozen mid-motion. And there, at the bottom corner, 2 signatures entwined, A. Voss and M. Voss. But the date stunned me. It was 10 years old, drawn before the first betrayal, before the erasures, before we had become adversaries. Adler cleared his throat. "There are more, if you wish to see them." He opened a second envelope. Inside were sketches, hundreds of them, variations of the same dream. The Sanctum Project, an unfinished monument he'd once promised to build with me. It had been shelved when sponsors withdrew, the prototype lost in a warehouse fire. I had forgotten it. He never had. Bursas. Back in my hotel, I spread the blueprints across the bed. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain, the scent of our old studio in Berlin. His handwriting curved along the margins. Notes, questions, tiny pleas. Would marble carry the sound of wind? Reading them was like hearing his voice again. Not the manipulator or the rival, but the man who used to fall asleep mid-sketch, graphite smudged on his cheek. I hated that it moved me. When Lena called that evening, I told her about the archive. "Legally," she said, It's yours. You could sell the rights or burn it. Whatever you choose. I don't want to profit from him, I said, but I don't want to erase him either. Silence hummed through the line. Then she said softly, maybe this is the first thing he's given you without taking something back. Masastar. And I spent the night studying the drawings. There was one sheet labeled Sanctum Final Revision. In faint pencil he'd written, for when she's ready to build again, not from anger, but from quiet. I traced the line with my finger. Had he known? Had he always known that everything, our love, our ruin, was just scaffolding for the woman I would become? The next morning, I took the plans to the atelier in Dubai. My team gathered around as I unrolled them on the drafting table. No one spoke at first. The design was haunting, modern yet ancient, as if conceived by someone who'd wrestled both ego and grace into submission. What is it? One of the interns asked. A ghost, I said, then softer, and maybe a beginning. If for months we worked in secret, I didn't announce the project publicly. I called it Sanctum Reborn, and I treated it not as his resurrection, but as reconciliation, between past and present, between creation and consequence. I kept one rule. Not a single line could remain unaltered. Every stroke of his pen had to meet mine halfway. Marble and bronze again, threaded with glass that caught the desert sun. The building would stand on the edge of the sea, where the tide erased its own marks every night. At first, I thought of it as atonement. Then, as it grew, I realized it was something quieter, understanding, the kind that doesn't forgive or forget, but accepts. Even when the first structure rose from the sand 2 years later, the world noticed. Reporters called it a cathedral for silence. Critics wrote that it felt like stepping inside the memory of two people who once dreamed the same dream and failed beautifully. During the opening ceremony, I stood alone beneath the vaulted roof. Sunlight poured through the glass, breaking into thousands of fractured rays. The acoustics caught the sound of the waves outside, folding them into the air like breath. A journalist asked me, "Was this built for him?" I smiled faintly. No, it was built for what remains after him. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, I walked through the empty hall. The marble floor reflected the fading gold of sunset, each reflection bending gently, as if alive. I stopped in the center, where a plaque had been embedded into the stone, one I hadn't approved. It read, "For A and M, two halves of one design, complete only in fracture." I didn't know who had placed it there. Maybe Lena, maybe one of the builders, maybe fate itself, signing the blueprint neither of us could finish alone. I knelt and touched the words. The marble was warm beneath my palm, as if it remembered the hands that shaped it, and for the first time in years, I whispered his name without anger. And when I stepped outside, night had fallen. The sea shimmered black and infinite. I turned back toward the building, its facade glowing from within, a pulse of light against darkness. It didn't feel like his anymore, or mine. It felt like peace, finally materialized. I took a deep breath, letting the salt wind fill my lungs, and for the first time since the day my name vanished from that gallery plaque, I felt whole. No vengeance, no victory, just the stillness of something complete. Yet, as I walked away, I couldn't help but glance back once more. The lights inside flickered faintly, just once, like a heartbeat, like a whisper caught in the walls. And I thought, maybe legacy isn't about who's remembered. Maybe it's about what keeps breathing after we're gone. Or when the doors of Sanctum Reborn opened to the public, the desert wind carried a low hum through the archways, the kind of sound marble makes when it expands under heat, like breath trapped inside stone. The first visitors stepped in slowly, whispering as if entering a holy place. They didn't know it, but the silence was deliberate. I'd designed the space to respond to footsteps. 1,000 microsensors beneath the marble tiles captured vibration and translated it into faint, harmonic frequencies. Each person who entered added their own sound to the space, an invisible choir of humanity, ever-changing, never repeating. It was my quiet rebellion against permanence, against the idea that art should belong to the dead. But what I didn't anticipate was how quickly the world would claim it. Within weeks, the structure became a phenomenon. The New York Times called it a temple of grief and rebirth. Le Monde described it as a dialogue between ghosts and light. Tourists renamed it the Museum of Echoes. They took selfies against the golden fractures in the marble, the seams I had left raw to symbolize imperfection. Influencers filmed reels with captions like, "Healing through architecture," and "Forgive yourself like Mira did. Forgive." It wasn't the word I would have chosen, but stories, once released, belong to no one, not even their creators. At first, I resisted the urge to interfere. I told myself it was enough that the structure existed, that people were finding something inside it, even if it wasn't what I intended. But the distortions grew louder. An art magazine published an essay claiming Sanctum was a collaboration, finished posthumously using Alexander's recovered blueprints, that I had completed his vision as an act of repentance. The author called it, "The Architect's Redemption Through the Widow's Hand." I stared at the sentence until the words blurred. I wasn't his widow, and I hadn't redeemed him. I had redeemed myself. Yet the narrative spread. Documentaries followed. A studio reached out for film rights. Mira Atelier received record commissions. Not for my work, but for the myth of us, the cursed lovers whose art outlived their ruin. I'd built a monument to silence, and the world filled it with noise. One evening, after a panel in Paris, a journalist asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you believe that in the end, Alexander's spirit lives through Sanctum? The audience leaned forward, cameras ready. I could have smiled, delivered the practiced line, "Art transcends the individual," but something in me rebelled. "No," I said quietly. "Alexander doesn't live through this place. He died the moment he stopped creating. Sanctum isn't his ghost. It's mine, the part of me that survived him." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Then came the applause, cautious at first, then rising like surf. But applause can't drown unease. I left the event before it ended, slipping into the cold Paris night, my hands still trembling. Back in Dubai, Sanctum Reborn had become a pilgrimage site. People left offerings at the base of the central column. Sketches, poems, wedding rings, fragments of lives they no longer wanted to carry. Some nights, I walked through the galleries after closing, collecting what they left behind. One note stopped me. It was scrawled on rough paper, childlike in its simplicity. I came here to forget someone, but the building made me remember instead. Thank you. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. That was when I understood. The world would always reshape my story, twist it into allegory, mythology, tragedy. But somewhere in the noise, people were still finding truth. Maybe not my truth, but a truth nonetheless. And that, I decided, was enough. Months passed. I began designing again. Smaller, quieter spaces. A library for blind children in Naples. A memorial garden in Kyoto. Projects that didn't demand spectacle. Projects that breathed. But Sanctum refused to fade. Every magazine, every exhibition invitation linked my name to it. Mira Voss, creator of the Museum of Echoes. Once I would have fought to correct them. Now, I just nodded. Because maybe that's what legacy really is. Not ownership, but surrender. And still, one mystery lingered. While reviewing architectural maintenance reports, I noticed a discrepancy in the building's systems. Occasional fluctuations in the acoustic sensors between 2 and 3 a.m., when the pavilion was empty. No alarms, no power surges, just soft rhythmic frequencies, too structured to be random. I stayed one night to see for myself. The halls were dark, except for the faint blue glow of emergency lights. My footsteps echoed softly against the marble, harmonizing with the building's hidden tones. I reached the central atrium, the heart of the structure, where the two mirrored figures stood. For a moment, nothing. Then a sound rose, faint but distinct. A pattern of frequencies humming through the sensors, shaping into something almost melodic. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. 3 tones. Pause. 2 more. A single repeat. It took me a minute to recognize the sequence. It was our old studio alarm code. My throat tightened. "Alexander," I whispered to the dark, half laughing at my own foolishness. The sensors flickered once, then stilled. The sound ceased. Maybe it was interference. Maybe coincidence. Or maybe the building, our building, had learned to remember us both. And when dawn came, the marble glowed like skin kissed by the first light. I stood beneath the fractured archway and felt something I hadn't in years. Serenity without sorrow. The building no longer belonged to him, or to me, or to the world. It belonged to the echoes. To everyone who walked inside carrying their own stories, their own ghosts, their own fractures. And perhaps that was the truest kind of immortality. Not to be remembered perfectly, but to be remembered differently by everyone who looked at you. Then that morning, before leaving, I wrote a small inscription at the base of the main arch, hidden behind a panel where only future restorers might find it. This was never about forgiveness. It was about sound finding its way through stone. Then I stepped outside, into the sunlight, and felt the desert wind rush through my hair like a breath released after too long held. For the first time in forever, I didn't feel like marble or fire. I felt human again. Years later, when the desert had already softened the hard edges of Sanctum Reborn with sand and time, I returned alone. There were no press cameras now, no speeches, no curators waiting at the gate. The crowds had thinned. The world had moved on to newer architects, louder stories, younger symbols. I preferred it that way. The glass facade shimmered faintly under a diluted sunrise. The air smelled of dust and salt. A thin layer of sand whispered across the marble floor as I entered, each step waking a low murmur from the old sensors, the ghost of sound still living inside stone. The first thing I noticed was how the building had aged gracefully. The gold seams that once filled the fractures were dimmer now, but still luminous, like scars that had learned to breathe. The marble figures at the center, the mirror and the fire, had taken on a patina of human touch. Visitors had traced their hands over the stone so often that it glowed where it had once been cold. I placed my palm there too, and the warmth met me like recognition. For years I'd avoided this place, telling myself I'd left it behind, that I was done with echoes and ghosts. But time, I learned, is a patient architect. It rebuilds what grief tears down, differently, but sturdily. After Alexander's death, I had promised myself I would never again build anything born from vengeance or memory. I kept that promise mostly. I filled my life with smaller works. A school carved into the cliffs of Santorini, a hospital atrium shaped to funnel wind instead of air conditioning, a fountain in Lisbon whose ripples spelled Braille when the water was still. I became a name again, but a quieter one. Critics called my later works the era of light. I called them peace. And yet, even peace leaves unfinished work. Because inside every creation, no matter how serene, there remained a question. Who am I when I stopped trying to prove I survived? And the world continued to rewrite me. They called Sanctum a love story now, the final collaboration between two broken hearts who found eternity in design. I stopped correcting them. The myth had become its own architecture, one I no longer had to live inside. But that morning, standing beneath the curved ceiling that once held both our names, I understood why I had come back. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't guilt. It was closure, not the cinematic kind, but the quiet closing of a blueprint that had stayed open too long. I climbed the narrow staircase behind the central arch, a space no visitor ever saw. At the top was a small maintenance platform overlooking the entire atrium. The sunlight pooled there in perfect symmetry, painting the floor below in gold and shadow. I pulled from my satchel a rolled sheet of paper, my last drawing. It wasn't a monument or a commission. It was simple. A house, a single-level structure of stone and wood. No glass, no metal. Open walls that let the wind through. A place where I could end, not as legend, but as person. The title block read, Blueprint for Silence. I smiled, realizing how far I'd traveled to return to simplicity. For decades, I had sculpted my identity in marble and gold, each structure a declaration of defiance. But what I wanted now was gentleness, impermanence. I wanted to build something that didn't need to outlive me. As I rolled the paper back, I noticed movement below. A child, maybe 7 or 8, had wandered into the atrium, her parents trailing behind. She was tracing her fingertips along the same golden crack that had once symbolized all my pain. "Mom," she said, her voice echoing softly. "Why is it broken?" Her mother smiled. "Because the woman who made it said broken things can still be beautiful." The child nodded solemnly. "I like it better this way." Something inside me loosened. Maybe legacy wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it was just a conversation that never ends, from one pair of hands to another. I descended the stairs and walked toward the marble figures. The girl and her parents had left, but their voices still lingered faintly in the air. I ran my hand over the old inscription hidden at the base. This was never about forgiveness. I smiled. How young I'd been when I wrote that. How certain that strength meant refusal. Now, older, softer, I whispered. It was always about forgiveness. I just didn't know it yet. The building seemed to exhale, the soft hum of its sensors blending with the wind, until it sounded almost human. For a fleeting moment, I imagined Alexander's voice among the frequencies, not as accusation, not even as apology, but as harmony. Maybe that was what he had meant all along, that we were two halves of one design, never meant to be finished, only to echo. And outside, the desert horizon shimmered. The dunes shifted like memory itself, erased and rewritten with every breath of wind. I walked until I reached the edge of the sea, where the salt met the sand. I took the blueprint from my bag and placed it on the water's edge. The tide caught it gently, curling the paper like a hand closing around a secret. It drifted away, pale against the blue, dissolving as it went. No marble, no monument, just paper and salt, a design meant to vanish. Bearer inspired the team. When I returned to Sanctum one last time, I left my architect's ring on the golden crack, the same ring I'd worn since the day I opened my first studio. It gleamed briefly under the sunlight before fading into the seam, like a final punctuation mark in a story that no longer needed words. Then I turned away. As I walked into the vastness of the desert, I didn't look back this time. The air shimmered behind me, and for a moment the building seemed to bend in the heat, the marble alive, the echoes singing. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was memory, maybe it was both. All I knew was that I was free, and freedom, I realized, was never about erasing the past. It was about finally being able to build without it. And my husband tried to erase me. I rebuilt myself in marble and gold, follows Mira Voss, an architect betrayed by her husband and creative partner Alexander, who steals her work and erases her from their shared empire. Humiliated and stripped of identity, Mira rises again, building a new career through brilliance and strategy. Her comeback culminates in The Mirror and the Fire, a sculpture that exposes Alexander's fraud and reclaims her name. But victory turns complex. Alexander retaliates with deception and legal manipulation before his empire collapses, and he dies by suicide. In the aftermath, Mira inherits his unfinished designs and transforms them into Sanctum Reborn, a monument not to him, but to survival, imperfection, and truth. Years later, she returns to the site, now known as the Museum of Echoes, to confront the myth the world built around their tragedy. In the stillness of her final visit, she understands that creation, not revenge, is her truest legacy. The story ends where it began, with a woman carving herself back into existence, not from rage, but from peace, her name now etched not in marble, but in memory.